Number 1.
Joshua got into an argument with his mother and departed from his Centralia, Illinois home on October 12, 1991. He climbed out his bedroom window and left with another boy. He has never been heard from again. According to one account, he was later sighted with another teenage boy, leaving a shopping center in a blue Ford Maverick with a friend, Terry Martin, and Martin's girlfriend. Martin and the other boy returned hours later. The car was mud-splattered and Joshua wasn't with him. He has never been heard from again. Joshua had been known to run away for several days at a time, so his mother was initially unconcerned by his absence. She began to worry after weeks passed without any sign of him, and she reported him missing on November 12. Martin is a suspect in Joshua's disappearance. In 2003, while in jail, he allegedly told another inmate that he had killed a boy named Josh in 1991. A witness, Tanya L. Collins, who was in her teens in 1991, told authorities that she'd witnessed Joshua's torture and murder in a satanic-type ritual in the Devil's Playground area of Centralia. She passed a polygraph about the case in 1996 but failed a second one in 2008. In 2008, she was placed under hypnosis and led authorities to Joshua's supposed burial site in the Devil's Playground, but a dig of the area produced nothing. Collins named Martin as Joshua's killer. It was she who claims she saw them leave the shopping center together. Martin has an extensive criminal record. In 1993, he beat a man with a baseball bat and almost killed him. In 1999, he was sentenced to 22 years in prison for the rape of a 6-year-old girl. He was paroled in 2010, but allegedly failed to register as a sex offender and was rearrested. Joshua and Martin burglarized a small grocery together prior to Joshua's disappearance. Joshua testified against Martin in that case, and Martin was ultimately sentenced to 4 years in prison. Joshua was also allegedly seeing Martin's girlfriend in secret, something Martin denies. Martin admits that he was friends with Collins and Joshua in 1991, but says he didn't harm Joshua and doesn't know what happened to him. He stated Joshua often talked about running away, possibly to Kentucky, which was where his father lived. Authorities believe Joshua is probably deceased, but they're unsure as to what happened to him. His case remains unsolved.
Number 2.
Michael spent the night at a friend's home in Wasilla, Alaska on June 4, 1999. The night, he slipped out of the house and attended a graduation party with 3 friends near the Meadow Lake subdivision outside of Wasilla. He was last seen riding a bicycle down Pittman Road in the direction of his family's residence at approximately 4 a.m. His residence was approximately 9 miles from the location of the party. His friends had been riding with him, but he fell behind them. They waited for him at the 7-Eleven on Parks Highway but gave up and assumed he went home. He never did arrive at his residence, however. His mother reported him missing at 3 p.m. that day, 11 hours after he was last seen. Michael has never been seen again. The bicycle, which he had borrowed, was located sometime later in the Little Susitna River, which runs roughly parallel to the Pittman Road and Silver Drive intersection. Michael's high-top Converse sneakers were also discovered near a private runway for a homeowner's personal aircraft. They were wet and muddy. No other evidence concerning his whereabouts was discovered. Some reports have speculated that Michael may have been beaten by an unknown suspect or suspects while riding his bicycle. A local youth claimed he witnessed Michael being beaten and shot on a bridge, but later the young man admitted he had made up the story. Others have theorized that Michael may have fallen into the river and died of hypothermia shortly afterwards, but tracker dogs could not trace his scent there, and no one saw a body in the still, clear water. Michael's older brother, Charles Chucky Palmer V., disappeared near Talkeetna, Alaska in April 2010, almost 11 years after Michael vanished. Charles was 30 years old at the time. He went on a snow machine ride and never returned, and his snow machine was later found stuck in the deep snow. He is presumed to have perished of exposure and was declared legally dead in April 2011. Michael's family stated he was not a troubled teen in 1999, and it would be unlike him to run away from home and be gone for so long without contacting his family. His father believes he may be deceased. His case remains unsolved.
Number 3.
Palmer was last seen in Fall River Mills, California at 4:30 p.m. on April 20, 2018. She took an unleashed dog for a walk in the woods southeast of her home, which was in the 23,000 block of Castle Fall River Road. She left all her belongings behind, including her phone, wallet and purse, but may have been carrying a can of light beer and may have had her eyeglasses. Palmer was expected to be gone about 15 minutes, but she never returned and has never been heard from again. Her husband of 20 years began looking for her after 25 minutes, started calling the neighbors after 45 minutes to ask if they'd seen her, and notified the police after 2 hours. The dog is described as a grey, black and white female Australian cattle dog, also known as a blue heeler, named Lucy. Lucy was Palmer's stepdaughter's dog. Palmer's stepdaughter lived 20 miles away, and Palmer and her husband were taking care of the dog for a few days. Lucy returned, uninjured and in good health but alone, 4 days after Palmer's disappearance. When offered food and water, the dog drank but didn't eat, suggesting that she had been fed while she was away. A month after Palmer's disappearance, investigators stated she was missing under suspicious circumstances. She is a retired nurse who had worked at the local hospital and hospice and is described as a very social, active person who volunteered at a thrift store and regularly went bowling with friends. Her case remains unsolved.
Number 4.
Nimbach was last seen in St. Petersburg, Florida on February 17, 2009. A police officer saw her sleeping behind a building in the 4800 block of 49th Street near Memorial Park Cemetery. He woke her and told her about local homeless shelters. Nimbach had left a domestic violence shelter the previous day. She told the officer she was leaving her abusive boyfriend and would travel to another shelter. She never showed up at any local shelters and has never been heard from again. Nimbach was a transient at the time of her disappearance, but she always kept in touch with her family. Due to her transient lifestyle, the police refused to accept a missing persons report until March 31, 6 weeks after she was last seen. Nimbach grew up in Michigan and enrolled in Wayne State University to study nursing, but dropped out after 2 years and moved to Florida. She became addicted to oxycodone in 2007. She stayed briefly in 2 drug rehabilitation centers in June 2008, then returned to Florida in July and stayed there until November. Nimbach attempted suicide in Florida in late November 2008. Following her release from the hospital, she returned to Kentucky and stayed until January, when she returned to Florida to attend the pre-trial hearing for a court case against her. The charge was assaulting a police officer, and Nimbach was not concerned, as she believed she would probably be put on probation. She disappeared a week before the hearing. Nimbach's loved ones fear for her safety due to her lifestyle, drug addiction and lack of contact. Her case remains unsolved. Some agencies state Nimbach disappeared from Largo, Florida.
Number 5.
Greenfield was last seen during the early morning hours of March 18, 2018. Friends picked him up at his mother's house in Oregon and drove him to the Lucky 7 Casino in Smith River, California, 15 minutes away. He was a regular there. He went into the casino at 1 a.m. and left at 1:50 with an adult Caucasian male. They walked south across the parking lot near Highway 101. Greenfield has never been heard from again, and 18 minutes later the other man went back into the casino alone. Police were able to identify and question this person, who stated he and Greenfield parted ways after leaving the casino. The other man's identity has not been publicly released. Greenfield's cellular phone was Wi-Fi only and had no data, and there's been no electronic trace of it since it disconnected from the casino's Wi-Fi. He left behind his favorite jacket, his identification and his food stamp card. He didn't drive or own a car and relied on his family for support. It's uncharacteristic of him to be out of touch with his sister and his mother. He had never before gone more than a day or two without contacting them. His father lived hundreds of miles away and was sick when Greenfield disappeared. He has since died. Foul play is suspected in Greenfield's disappearance, and police think multiple people have knowledge of what happened to him. His case remains unsolved.
Number 6.
Linda and her husband, Jonathan Sohus, sometimes called John in media accounts, disappeared from their home in the 1900 block of Lorraine Road in San Marino, California on February 8, 1985. They said they were going to Connecticut to look for employment. They never returned home. The couple was reported missing on April 8, 2 months after they were last seen. They left behind their 4 cats, and Linda left her job at the science fiction fantasy bookstore Dangerous Visions. Authorities stated they had a happy marriage and weren't having any problems in their lives in 1985. They lived with Jonathan's mother, who died 3 years later. There is some evidence that Linda was alive in the years following her disappearance. Some of Linda's friends and relatives received postcards supposedly written by her and mailed from France, but authorities were unable to authenticate the writing on the cards. Handwriting experts disagree as to whether they were in Linda's writing or not. Her boss also received calls from a credit card company and an employer, asking her to serve as a reference for Linda. At the time of their disappearances, the Sohuses were renting out a guest house on their property. Their tenant, Christopher Chichester, told John and Linda's friends and co-workers that they'd gone to Paris for an extended honeymoon, then that they were on the East Coast doing secret government work. Chichester himself disappeared before the police could interview him. Around the time of the Sohus' disappearances, neighbors reported a foul smell coming from the guest house chimney, and investigators later found a sizable amount of blood in the house. A few months later, a friend of Chichester noticed a patch of disturbed ground near the guest house. He accepted Chichester's explanation that the digging had been due to plumbing problems. In 1988, Chichester resurfaced in Connecticut, using the name Christopher Mountbatten Crowe. He tried, without success, to sell a white Nissan pickup truck belonging to Jonathan. Again, he left the area before the police could question him. The Sohus' property was eventually sold. In 1994, when the new owners were putting in a swimming pool, they found the partial skeleton of a small adult Caucasian male wrapped in 3 plastic bags. The man had died of blunt force trauma to the head. The skeleton matched Jonathan's characteristics, but authorities were unable to identify it for years because there was no jawbone or teeth, and they didn't have a DNA sample from Jonathan's biological relatives. The skeleton was finally conclusively identified as his in 2010. Investigators excavated the property and used ground-penetrating radar to look for a second body, but they found nothing of interest. The Sohus case received additional attention in 2008 when Clark Rockefeller kidnapped his young daughter during a custody dispute with his ex-wife. He assaulted the social worker supervising their visitation, fled and took the child from Massachusetts to Baltimore, Maryland, and was arrested there a week later. Authorities determined that Clark Rockefeller and Christopher Chichester were the same person and that his real identity was Christian Karl Gerhartsrieder, born in West Germany in 1961. Gerhartsrieder came to the United States as an exchange student when he was in his teens and subsequently took on a number of identities. He attended a high school in Connecticut and, for a short period, the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He married in Wisconsin in 1981, but his wife later said he left her the day after the wedding. She finally obtained a divorce in 1992. Gerhartsrieder moved to California and started calling himself Christopher Chichester in 1983. He claimed he was a baronet and gave the impression of being a wealthy, cultured individual. He adopted the Rockefeller identity in 1993 and posed as a member of the wealthy and prominent family of the same name. His wife filed for divorce in 2006 after a 12-year marriage. She moved to England with their daughter, and her ex-husband was granted only 3 supervised visitations a year. It was during one of those visits that Gerhartsrieder abducted the child. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for the kidnapping. Photos of him are posted with this case summary. In March 2011, Gerhartsrieder was charged with Jonathan's murder. He was still serving his sentence in Massachusetts for kidnapping at the time. He has not been charged in connection with Linda's disappearance. His attorney stated Gerhartsrieder remembered little of his life before 1993, barely knew the Sohuses and was not involved in their cases. At his trial in 2013, Gerhartsrieder's defense admitted he had committed many crimes but maintained he was innocent of murder. The defense suggested Linda had murdered her husband and then walked out of her life. The prosecution's case against Gerhartsrieder was almost wholly circumstantial, no motive for the murder was suggested, and he did not testify. He was convicted of Jonathan's murder in April 2013. The prosecution believes Gerhartsrieder murdered Linda as well. Linda was very interested in science fiction and belonged to the Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society. She also enjoyed painting animals and fantasy creatures under the pseudonym Cody and sometimes took commissions for paintings. Linda's case remains unsolved and foul play is suspected.
Number 7.
Cherry's mother and stepfather, Elizabeth Ann Turek Vassar and Larry Vassar, had custody of her in 1986. They moved from Nashville, Tennessee to St. Louis, Missouri that year. Elizabeth, who was also known as Sissy, disappeared from their home in St. Louis on December 1, 1986. She was discovered in the Mississippi River over 2 months later in February 1987 as the victim of homicide. There was no trace of Cherry at the scene. Authorities know that Elizabeth worked as a prostitute for her husband on Independence Avenue in St. Louis. She remained unidentified for 7 years until her family members contacted authorities and reported Elizabeth and Cherry as missing persons. The investigation into Cherry's case began at that time. Cherry was apparently last seen in Kansas City, Missouri with Larry on January 7, 1987. She disappeared from that location and has never been heard from again. Investigators located Larry in prison for armed robbery in the mid-1990s. He will be incarcerated until at least 2028. Larry told authorities that he knew where his stepdaughter was located. He has stated Cherry is being looked after by his family members and living under another name in the Kansas City area. She may not even know she is a missing child. At one point, Larry offered to give Elizabeth's mother photographs of Cherry and a recording of her voice if she paid him $500. Cherry was supposed to remain in the custody of other relatives after her mother's death. Due to the complexities in this case, Cherry's disappearance is classified as a non-family abduction, although her stepfather claims to know her whereabouts. Her case remains unsolved.